Hello guys, Dominic again here with another video. Today I was going to talk about giants and how they're related to today in the modern times. Because today I was watching, or a couple days ago I was watching Beowulf, the 2005 version, and there's fantastical elements within the story, but it's treated as a historical account in the sense that there's real groups of people such as the Danes and the Geats, and there's even historical figures mentioned, as well as real religions. But it centers around a giant terrorizing the town of the Danes, and the giant is seen as this mythologized force of either maybe a bear that got too strong for its britches, or it's seen as a force of nature which terrorized the landscape. But either way, Beowulf is basically a champion who goes and slays a giant and helps the Danes. And basically, it relates to today because it implies one of two things: the academic or mainstream narrative of history, or the collective memory of our ancestors, and which one is going to be remembered or treated as more factual. Because the academic version of these stories is going to tell you that giants are exactly that. They're mythologized, anthropomorphized forces of nature that the people are trying to comprehend by equating them to something that is more understandable. And another explanation for where these giants come from is pre-scientific or pre-civilized societies coming into contact with giant skeletons or fossils of animals like mammoths or giant sloths or large bears or cats or whatever. And they would see a femur, they would see a forearm, and they would think that it was a giant person. Or even also it's thought that the Cyclops myth comes from the skull of the mammoth and its large naval cavity in the center of its skull. Now, this is the academic explanation for why our ancestors are describing giants. However, the alternative explanation, which would be more of the theological explanation or the mythological explanation, if we were to interpret these things as actual historical accounts of our ancestors remembering real events, then the giants would be real in the sense they weren't just animals. There were animals too that were larger, but there were human beings that were larger than just 6 feet or even 7 feet tall. And this has a lot of implications for the trajectory that mainstream academia is taking us. And basically, it revolves around trying to create people to be more materialistic, more atheistic, and less accepting of mythological and theological premises. And this comes from Jesuit teachings and shapings, because the Jesuits, they were founded during the Counter-Reformation, or that was when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses challenging the Catholic Church and their authority that they claimed to have, starting a movement known as the Protestants. And so the Jesuits, to counter this, essentially were to institute their own versions of pedagogy or education, and they basically monopolized the education system in Europe. And by monopolizing the education system in Europe, they're able to reshape history and how people remember things like giants in the modern time. And ultimately, and I'm going to pull up a quote here in a minute, but it comes down to replacing the natural philosophy with mathematical empiricism. The mathematical empiricism is designed to create basically a spiritually void world, so that the people like the Jesuits who have this more advanced knowledge can use it against everyone else, and basically in secrecy. They have all, so basically it's like this group of people, they want to hoard all this spiritual knowledge and sacred teachings of history for themselves and give everyone else this mathematical empirical version that basically takes away all spiritual matters. And I'm going to pull up a quote here by Christopher Grenbreger, who was the student of Christopher Clavius, who are prominent Jesuits in shaping mainstream academia as we know it today. They were early in the Jesuits' history, coming in the 1500s and late or early 1600s. And we're going to read it right from their own words. So here's an article from Stanford, which is quoting Jesuits like Christopher Grenbreger and their mission to reshape academia as we know it. And this section right here is what we're going to be looking at. He's basically going to give a speech here, and this is describing how he didn't invite the Father General, and this upset the Father General because this guy, Grenbreger, he didn't really make many public appearances. And this is common of a lot of Jesuits. They typically operate in the shadows, and they give credit of their works to either Jesus or the Jesuit collective as a whole. But here he says, "You know that the whole of philosophy is divided chiefly into three kinds of sciences: natural, which is the philosophical approach; mathematical, which is empiricism; and the divine one that is called metaphysical. The first one verifies for itself things immersed in matter, that is, abstract neither from reality nor from reason. The last one assumes as its objects things that are utterly alien to matter." So he's talking about the physical and the spiritual. "Even if the other two might seem to have all things distributed between them, the middle one, however, which even by virtue of being in the middle, one can be said to be more excellent than the others, finding that in treating the same matters it is ascribed them to it itself in such a way that in its object it is nevertheless in no way defrauds the other sciences." So I'm not going to read the rest of the article, but I will link it if you guys or whoever else wants to read it. But it goes on in the article, basically, for a long time they've used the natural philosophies, and they continuously refer to the natural as the philosophical approach. But now they need to replace it because mathematics or empiricism is going to be the bridge between the three sciences. Before it was natural, the natural philosophies, but now people like Grenbreger and the Jesuits, they want to make it mathematics and empiricism, which bridges together the natural and the metaphysical. And basically what this does is it creates a more materialistic mindset and a more atheistic mindset as we detach from ourselves and put it into numbers. See, numbers are written on paper. It's written on dead matter. But what philosophers of the past were doing is they were looking within themselves and relating knowledge of the self, which for many millennia and centuries before this was considered the highest knowledge by pretty much every mystery tradition. They want to replace that natural philosophical approach with numbers written on paper based off of the empiricism of scientific observation guided by mathematical theory. Now, as he says, one science does not disprove the other science, but what it does make or ensure is that an organization with an agenda, such as the Jesuits, they're very open about their censorship. If they want to make the standard empiricism and scientific observation, that's not a big deal in and of itself. But the problem is that the people who actually run the academic institutions and the people who run the Catholic Church, they don't think that. They're more so thinking in the spiritual and natural matter. They're like Jesuits, for example. They believe to look within to hear the voice of God. This is not about empiricism. So essentially what they want to do is they want to reserve this more sacred knowledge for themselves and leave the rest of us in the dark world that has been crafted through these empiricist methods of living in a universe that is supposedly 93 billion miles in circumference, or that's the observable universe at least. And simultaneously the sun is 93 million miles away, and the universe is 13 or 14 billion years old. Essentially what the empiricist model has done is it has told us we live in this vast materialist universe guided by uncaring physical forces, while the people who gave us this stuff are over there. They're over there talking to God. They're over there communicating with all these spirits that the rest of us atheists and materialists can never communicate with, because we're stuck in this false paradigm they gave us. And this relates to the giants, because if ancient man is actually recording history with their myths, that's going to put a big problem on their empiricism, because we can't really verify that, for example, these giants existed. Now, there are numerous newspapers from the 1800s and the 1900s of giant skeletons being discovered. But either one of two things is true about these newspapers and discoveries. Either they were fabricated by the newspapers, journalists, or they were covered up by some sort of academic group like the Smithsonian or other groups, the government. Essentially, the people who gave us this empiricist method are the same people who control the tools and the means to measure these things in the first place. And that's a problem, because as I said, they're deceptive as it is, because they believe in these spiritual, more natural philosophical concepts, but they're giving everyone else these empiricist tools that don't really support what they believe, because you can't really measure someone communicating with the spirit. So ultimately, what this does is it creates distrust amongst people for the ancients, and it supplants that trust with the trust of modern academic authorities. Now, they don't need to go and, reinterpret or rewrite all these ancient scripts that talk about all these different things that are going on that seem fantastical beyond just giants. For example, in the Mahabharata, it's been described by a lot of people that it sounds like a nuclear war, or it sounds like they're using advanced technology, things like Vimanas, to wage battle against each other. And when a person reads this with the scientific paradigm, they're thinking that, okay, well, I know historically that these people didn't have access to technology like we do today. So that means that they're anthropomorphizing nature. So this is the assumption that they give us. Because the mainstream academic narrative says that these things didn't exist in the past, but the mythological record is telling a slightly different story. So now through this empiricist mathematical approach, which has been shaped by people who don't actually hold those same beliefs, when regular people who are uninitiated into more occult or mystery traditions, when they read these mythological stories, they're reading it with the lens of uniformitarianism and empiricism. Like I said, they lived in the past, they didn't have this technology, therefore they're anthropomorphizing nature, or they're psychologically explaining natural phenomenon in an understandable way. And essentially what this leads to is, why? What is the point of guiding humanity with a false narrative? If you're a group of people and your whole mission is supposedly to enlighten the world, like the Jesuits say their mission is, why are they crafting this education system centered around things that they don't actually genuinely believe or think themselves in their own practices? And it's because they're trying to create division so that when the time is right, they will enact essentially the ultimate or the final psyops, which will basically take all the conflict that they've orchestrated over the course of several hundred years of, like creating atheists and Christians. That is pretty much a dialectic that comes straight from this academic model. So when the time is right, they can unite these people under a synthesis. It's a problem, reaction, solution. So that way, they give the people this materialistic world. And then when the time is right, they will provide their light to the world, illuminating the materialistic world, which is basically the plan which will do this hinges upon all the work they did in the past. So when the light is removed from the world, or the spiritual thinking, and people become more atheistic, or they become too trusting of scientific instruments, then the priests, they can come in with the psyops, because remember, they're the ones who ultimately gave us this scientific paradigm in the first place, to make people more spiritual the way they want to. And, ultimately their end goal is the same as the myths describe in ancient Mesopotamia. They want to create an obedient working class of individuals who are just subservient and docile. And that's really what it comes down to. That's why they suppress things like knowledge of giants in the past. Because if people knew giants in the past existed, and they're typically described as being angry and they bully humans, they kill humans, or do all these bad things to humans, but somehow we outlived them, that might be too hopeful and inspiring for the people. The fact that humanity actually overcame these giants who were described as so terrible, like that in Beowulf, where one giant is basically just slaughtering the whole village of, hardened Viking warriors. And that's my video, guys. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something, or at least reconsidered, your views on the world. And I'll see you guys again.